Last session of this today workshop. We have a session on pandemics in the afternoon. So we have two papers. The first papers is presented by Andrew Butter from Indiana University with a bunch of colleagues. So Andrew, welcome, and the floor is yours for about 20 minutes.
All right, wonderful. Thank you very much. And so I want to just again say thank you for the organizers, Laurent and Simon, for putting on a wonderful workshop, as well as including our paper in the workshop. And then I also need to give, as was mentioned, the usual disclaimer, given that some of these co-authors are at the Federal Reserve of Chicago. So anything that I say doesn't express the views of the Federal Reserve System at large. And then I just would also want to mention that this work is also with a couple colleagues at Indiana University. And so the motivation, I'm going to be brief on the motivation for this paper. And this is going to be perhaps a slightly unconventional paper in terms of the approach, although I hope to persuade you that the approach is particularly well suited given the current environment that we're in. And it's going to be focusing on nowcasting or forecasting very, very short-term UI claims. Anytime I say UI claims, I mean unemployment insurance claims in the United States. And part of why UI claims are so important, or why they've been focused on so much in the United States, is because they're one of the most timely economic indicators of economic activity. So as early as late March, New York Times picked it up. We had truly unprecedented in this country, or the United States, historical surge in initial unemployment insurance claims. And so this was much larger than anything we experienced in a particular week in the Great Recession. So this New York Times front page is the entire 10-year time period of UI claims, and you can see the huge run-up that would have been the week ending March 21st. Initial claims for UI. And so the focus of this paper is going to be, with all this focus and attention in labor market conditions. Again, these are unemployment insurance claims that all these offices are being inundated with, and we'd like to be able to have a handle on both what's coming down the pike as well as what this means for economic activity. And so the focus will be, how could we have come up with a good nowcast or good forecasting model to pick up this surge in UI claims, and to emphasize why the surprise in this was so large. Just as motivation, is the Citigroup Economic Surprise Index. So that's this red line, just to give you a sense as to how uncertain this surge was, is the red line. The Google Trends, which will be the primary predictor that we use to put into our forecasting model, is the blue lines. And this is going to be the surge activity related to unemployment like topics. And then the gray bars are going to be the weekly UI claims as of week ending March 21st and week ending March 25th. These were the very first 2 weeks in the United States that saw the unprecedented surge in UI claims. There was a huge decrease in the consensus forecast for this surprise index as measured by the Citigroup Bank. And so, while we were all aware of the pandemic, and we were all aware certainly that there was going to be a large number, at least amongst consensus forecasts, this was certainly a surprise that resulted in March 21st, the first 2.2 million initial claims that resulted that week. So given this landscape, what has been done with Google Trends and what has been done in the past in terms of using it as a potentially real-time or very high-frequency indicator to predict UI claims. We're not the first to propose such an approach. So Choi and Varian have a paper primarily looking at the Great Recession that uses Google Trends as a predictor for initial UI claims, motivating it also as an example of a high-frequency timely indicator that might be a good one to track recessions. Unfortunately, the performance was only very mixed. So the overall fit was fairly poor, but there's now been a renewed interest in these models. So Paul Goldsmith and Pinkham and Aaron Sojourner have have a model that also uses Google Trends to track UI claims. Their model takes a pretty different approach than ours, but also again some renewed interest given the unprecedented time that we're in these days. And so what we're going to try to do, or what we're going to ask, is basically, can we build a robust model that would have done well at this very, very sharp and distinct turning point? And effectively, could we estimate a reliable elasticity? Again, the previous figure that I just showed you indicated there was some activity in Google search intensity related to unemployment activity, but again, having the appropriate parameter, having the appropriate structural elasticity to map what that surge in intensity would mean for a prediction or a nowcast of UI claims is really the fundamental part here that we're gonna try to offer, and in some respects very distinct from what other approaches that have used Google Trends in the past have done. And so again, anecdotally, so this is just the aggregate time series. So the blue is the aggregate time series of log search intensity of Google Trends for the unemployment topic, and the weekly national level initial UI claims for the United States. Again, over the time period, at least anecdotally, it would seem like these time series track pretty well. So again, having the appropriate elasticity seems to be the key here. And again, just to emphasize, a classic time series model is not going to do very well. So unfortunately, what's probably going on here is that there's a combination of lots of typical difficulties when it comes to building a robust time series model. So you have possible trends changes over this time period. The Google Trends measure itself is in fact probably ripe with measurement error, as well as simultaneity causality bias. So you'd imagine a recent law change or any sort of news event that is related to unemployment is likely to drive search related activity for unemployment terms, and that in no way might result, or it might no way be measuring the type of intensity that is related to filing or going and again initiating a claim. So with all of these caveats, what is our approach? Our approach is to basically leverage a source of variation in the data that we think actually is particularly informative of what might be the appropriate elasticity to apply in these circumstances. And so where is this variation? The variation is for is using hurricanes. And why are hurricanes nice, or why do they offer a lens to provide a nice nowcasting models? They induce very sharp and large changes in both UI take-up, but also the search intensity in Google Trends or on the Google platform. And why this is important is it's important because that search intensity is very likely explicitly driven by people filing claims. It's not otherwise confounding news in the media or a particular national legislation change. And so that variation is going to be particularly credible in coming up with the appropriate elasticity. And so what we're going to do is effectively conduct an event level study across all US hurricanes since 2004. And the reason why since 2004 is that's going to be dictated by the availability of the Google Trends, time series. So we're going to look at all hurricanes that created damage of over 10 billion and basically use that as the identifying variation to come up with the appropriate elasticity, and then track whether or not that would have done appropriately well in, say, the Great Recession as well as COVID. And so just to give you the punchline results, we find an elasticity that's quite large in an economic magnitude, and it certainly dwarfs any reduced form parameter estimate in these time series models that have used Google Trends in the past. And so we find a point estimate of 1.05. So you can interpret this, a 1% increase in Google search intensity, either at the state or the national level. The appropriate nowcast would be then you would expect a 1% increase in the UI claims that week. We also provide a series of uncertainty assessments around that point estimate. So we have several hurricane events. So we conduct a leave one out cross-validation exercise and come up with parameter bounds between 0.83 and 1.19. So again, a pretty tight window around our point estimate. We also show, although I won't assuredly have time to go through all of this, we show the point estimate is robust to several alternative explanations. So we shrink the window length, which I'll get to in a little bit, as well as look for potentially delayed effects of search activity resulting in further and further out claims. and find that the overall effect seems to be pretty robust at this 1.05 level. Also, we explored differences in UI generosity across states. So states have some jurisdiction to offer potentially different maximum length benefits or just overall benefits. And so we show that, again, the hurricane event analysis that we look at is pretty stable to those considerations. And so in terms of the punchline when it comes to COVID-19, so again, all of this analysis or all of the work in terms of getting the appropriate elasticities in some respects, leaving out COVID-19. So now with our point estimate in hand, what would that point estimate have resulted in, or what would it have led to in terms of you creating a nowcast for, say, those initial 2 weeks, at least in the United States experience of the UI experience? And what we would find would have been the week ending March 21st, we would have nowcasted initial UI claims number non-seasonally adjusted to have been 2.2 million. It turns out that came in at 2.9. So that's, I don't want to trivialize the miss there. That's still a miss, but it's certainly much better than most of the consensus forecasts that I've been aware of, and certainly better than some of the other models that I've seen. Go forward one more week, and the week ending March 28th, we would have predicted or nowcasted initial UI claims of 5.7 million, again, non-seasonally adjusted, and that came in at 5.8. And so, again, reasonably strong performance, at least in the initial 2 weeks. I'll show you a much longer, or over the entire period to this point, performance. It also is fairly good. Applying just a plain vanilla Choi and Varian model, a classic time series model with an additional predictor using Google Trends, we see there's just a huge difference in the performance. You know, a classic Choi and Varian model in that similar 2 week period would have missed the bulk of the surge or the run up. Okay, and just as a indication that this wasn't a data snooping exercise, again, these were forecasts. Again, the Chicago Fed was putting it into their memo, and these were predictions being made in real time. And so again, hopefully, just another plug for the value in the approach. All right, so let me get into a little bit more of the specifics of the data that we use. So the first is the Google Trends data. So for those of you who are not familiar, this is a publicly available summary of the volume of searches for a particular keyword. So again, if I'm boring you right now, you can switch screens or switch monitors and type in your favorite James Bond movie or your favorite cooking recipe, and you can see, even for a particular region, what would be the time series of searches on the Google platform related to that search term. So what are we going to use? We're going to use the unemployment topic. So in some respects, we're going to outsource some of maybe the big data, or what would maybe be the machine learning part to this empirical approach to Google. Google has a series of keywords, all of them related to or tied to things like unemployment, that they then collate together to put together an unemployment topic. And so that's going to be the series that we use. We're going to pull it for particular states. For, again, the hurricane analysis, we're going to pull it for particular states in the particular event years associated with the hurricanes. Obviously, for the COVID experience, we'll be pulling the unemployment topic for each state over this most recent time period. And what's the most important aspect of the Google Trends data is that it's available in real time. So this was as of yesterday. And so as of yesterday, you could have polled the Google Trends time series, or the Google search intensity of the unemployment topic. So you'll notice unemployment topic here for the last week. And so again, that real-time nature is important, because for UI claims and how they're reported in the United States, while they're one of the most timely indicators of economic activity, there is some lag. So it's a weekly time series, but the most recent information that we have for UI claims to date was released last Thursday, and is the number of initial UI claims that were reported week ending June 27th. So every Thursday, the Department of Labor will report a new UI number. And so in 2 days, we'll have the total number of initial claims that were filed as of July 4th. And so this is the dimension to which, again, having that real-time information with Google Trends would allow us to provide potentially, hopefully, a more accurate nowcast of what the current economic environment is, in this case, for UI claims. And so just to emphasize now and to highlight the novel part of the empirical approach, we're going to then take those two series and then try to come up with a credible estimate or credible elasticity to use for the nowcast using a hurricane sample. So we're going to exploit a 6-month window, 6 month leading up to and 6 month following period of the landfall of hurricanes. We're going to identify the state that was the most affected by those hurricanes and then test it through a series of robustness checks. So I'm going to go a little bit quick here now so I can get to the results. But so just as a indication of the credibleness of this approach, both damages, so measured damages of hurricanes, leads to a huge cumulative growth in UI claims. So again, these are the 12 events that will be in our hurricane analysis, as well as a huge run up in search activity for unemployment topics. So again, a strong positive association in both cases. And of course, that's going to be the key identifying variation for the elasticity that we care about. In the time series dimension, there's also very clear systematic patterns of a huge run up in both search intensity. So the search intensity is the blue line here, and then UI claims or initial UI claims net of an annual average is the black line. So this is for the Hurricane Katrina event. This was the 6 months leading up to and 6 months following. Harvey, a more recent hurricane that hit primarily Texas, similar pattern. So these are just the event studies. Across all of our hurricane samples, the effect, we find a large positive association between Google search intensity on the unemployment topic relative to changes in initial claims. So the base model to get our elasticity is going to be running a regression of log UI, the ratio of UI claims net of the national experience. So the time script here is 0 would be for the national UI claims. And on the right-hand side, we're going to have the Google Trends for the particular state that was affected most by the hurricane, denominated by the national experience. So the national experience here is going to allow us to control for just general arbitrary patterns of seasonality, as well as potential recessionary effects to the extent that there are some of our hurricane events are in the midst of a hurricane. So the hurricane results, here we see a point estimate there of the 1.05, and again, across our leave one out exercise across all of our hurricane events, we find a relative stability of the point estimate. So again, ranging between just above 0.83 to just above about 1.2. So again, relative stability, and even the out of sample forecasting or R squared, excuse me, for the hurricane events comes out to be about 70%, and that's the truly out of sample forecast. So then how does it map to COVID? So we take all of the states and now construct, based off of the state's experience of Google search intensity, what then would have been a nowcast for that particular state's UI claims, and then aggregate up to a national level. And so you have the week ending March 21st, you have here a strong kind of one-to-one relationship. Part of that is certainly just the heterogeneity in states' population sizes, but again, the forecast, generally speaking, once we aggregate up to the national level, it seemed to be, although a little bit under, a particularly good forecast for that very, very first unprecedented UI claim surge. Flash forward 1 week, and again, we have a similar strong pattern. And I've highlighted a few states, just given the nature of the fact that for some of the states that we over forecasted in the first week, they turn out to be under forecast, and so some of the error component here are going to net out over the entire time series length of COVID-19 for the entire 15-week period. And so what I've done here is created a prediction interval that simply is the min and max aggregate implied by summing up the states. So again, this is probably a little bit overly conservative in terms of the uncertainty around the forecast, but what you'll notice here is again a very well calibrated forecast for the US national number in terms of UI claims. In terms of the state level, the 95% prediction interval comes out to cover about 90% of the state week observations over the 15-week period of COVID. So I know I'm pretty much out of time, so let me just offer up two pieces that are potentially shortcomings of the model. So we radically, in terms of the scheme of things, over predict or over forecast, nowcast the UI claims associated with the week ending April 4th. This turns out to be the week that the PUA, or sorry, the Pandemic Unemployment Insurance Law came into effect. And so what's very likely to be the case there, is that that was a period of time when a lot of search was being induced by the change in legislation. And so it turns out that when you include the resulting claims that came in through pandemic unemployment assistance, our forecasts turn out to be even better. And so here's the cumulative growth in UI claims, and the red dot and the red marks are the ones when you add in the additional PUA claims that came in for each state. And so what you can see here is probably a lot of both the over forecast that resulted in April 4th, but also the forecast that resulted are certainly picking up the activity that's related to pandemic unemployment insurance as well. So I will stop here so that I ensure that I stay on time, but let me just conclude. So again, I think we provide a novel empirical approach to estimating the key structural parameter that you would want to use in terms of creating nowcasts. And this was primarily based off of leveraging the sharp changes being driven by hurricanes. And I think in some respect, the discussion that's happened earlier in these sessions indicates that hurricanes might actually offer a nice source of variation when it comes to tracking out the dynamic changes of this pandemic as well. The elasticity is near 1, which is, again, much larger than historical models that have used this information. And again, it seems like it's very scalable in the COVID experience. So I'll stop here.
Okay, thanks a lot, Andrew, for this presentation and this smart identification. So I don't know if we have questions from the floor. Laura, yeah?
Yes, so it's very nice. I like it. And I just have a little bit of concern, maybe it's addressing the paper, is that because of the pandemic, everyone is locked down at home, and the overall usage of the internet will be increased as well. So then probably the search of every word will increasing. So in that sense, maybe like a robustness check will be normalize the search of the keywords of UI by the total search of all the keywords, or normalize compare it with some other irrelevant keywords. So yeah,
so it's a great question, and I apologize for not addressing it when I introduced the data. So no, so the Google search data, in fact, some of the efforts that Google makes to mask the data that's made publicly available, it is scaled in terms of the volume of search. So so the term that you're queuing in for is always that particular area and that particular time period normalized by the volume of search.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks.
Can I follow up a question on Laura? The other side of the coin is that during the pandemic, there was a huge bottleneck that the unemployment claims people couldn't even submit. You must have faced that, right?
Yep. No, and so so I apologize again for running out of time. So yeah, we actually see that as well. So one of the let me just so one of the particularly worst case scenarios in that was actually Washington. Washington basically unveiled, unfortunately, was in the midst of unveiling a new website amidst the COVID-19 experience, and so had basically a huge backlog and a huge delay in when people were able to finally go onto the website and finally a working website and finally file those claims. And so interestingly enough, that happened at a much later date in the pandemic than when almost all the other states were experiencing their surges. And so in the week ending April 25th, in the cross section, we do see this Google search intensity have a disproportionate increase in the state of Washington, exactly coincidentally with when the claims ended up being filed. And so, again, this is, and there are other experiences. The model also seems to do a very good job at picking up which states are lumping in PUA with their regular UI claims reporting, and which states are obviously doing it separately. And so, yeah, there are, you know, the heterogeneity across states is a really nice other sort of piece of evidence that I think we can provide to the value of the model.
Thank you, Andrew.
Andrew, there is a question from Dean Crushore and about the Google Trend data and its replicability. In fact, Dean reminded us a debate between Simon Van Orden and Al Varian on Econ Browser a few years ago. And in fact, it seems that the data come from a sample, and if you and I enter the same keyword at the same time, we get different data. So how do you manage this point?
Yep. So the way that yes, so that is a great point, and in some respects, I think one of the actual real probably reasons why historical models with Google Trends have had so much difficulty. So 2 points to that. One is we address it by pulling the data at six separate times and then averaging. So in some respects, we're hoping that is pure measurement error. The fact that, again, depending on which IP address and the timing at which you would pull the data, that you would get a potentially slightly different answer. So that's one piece and that's really attempting to avoid the measurement error being induced for the COVID-19 forecast. The benefit of we do it for the hurricane analysis as well, but in some respects, one of the features of the hurricane sample and getting that elasticity to begin with is that it is leveraging such the sharp increase in search intensity and UI claims. So in some respects, we're in terms of the signal to noise ratio that's being created by that measurement error in the sample, you know, I think we're protecting ourselves a little bit from focusing on the hurricanes to get the elasticity in the first place. But the short answer in terms of the COVID episode is that we pull it six times and then average the results from the polls.
So on this point, in fact, I remember I had a discussion with Al Varian, and what he was saying is that, in fact, if you get the Google Trend data, and if you normalize the Google Trend data at any point in time, in fact, you are able to replicate the same shape in the data. So it's more or less a question of normalization. So I didn't check myself in with the data, but this is something that could be checked to be sure. And in fact, that was a response of Hal Varian to Van Orden in the Econ Browser debate.
Thank you. That's a wonderful comment. I mean, we'll certainly we can push more on that front for sure.
Okay, so I think we can stop here. Thanks a lot, Andrew, for this fascinating presentation. Many thanks.
Thank you.
And let's move on to the last presentation of the day by Laura. So Laura is going to present us a joint work with Roger Moon and Frank Schofheide on panel forecasting. So Laura, you are the last of the workshop, last but least for sure. And the floor is yours, we'll listen to you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So can you hear me, right? So I would like to thank our wonderful organizers, Lahong and Simon, for this great workshop. It's an honor to be part of it. And also I would like to thank all the speakers in the last 2 days. I have learned a lot about the forecasting on the frontier of pandemic. So thank you very much. And today I'm excited to show you our new paper, panel forecast of country-level COVID-19 infection. So it's a joint work with Roger Moon from USC and Frank Schofheide from Penn. So the goal of this paper is to provide forecast of COVID-19 infections for a panel of countries and regions. So a very useful observation is that the outbreaks did not take place simultaneously in all countries. So then there could be a margin that we could exploit, that we learn from the countries that starts early, such as China, to sharpen the inference and forecast of countries that starts late, like Germany. So at the same time, it's also important to account for heterogeneity across countries. So we don't want to simply just say the pattern of China and the pattern of Germany are exactly the same. That doesn't make much sense, right? So then basically, the model would need to serve two purposes. First, it wants to help us to learn from the early countries. And at the same time, we need also account for heterogeneity. Then this makes dynamic panel data models is a good workhorse for this forecasting exercise. So in the recent literature of panel forecasting, in our earlier papers, we are trying to develop econometrics tools that help with panel forecasting in a linear and top-based setup. And in this paper here, we're kind of based on this general idea of panel forecasting and tailor it to account the specific dynamics of the pandemic. So the basic idea of panel forecasting would be that we allow different countries have different coefficients. And then the heterogeneous coefficients are drawn from an underlying distribution. This underlying distribution is unknown and unobserved. So we need to combine information from the whole cross-section, from all the countries, to estimate this unknown distribution. So we see that basically because of this idea, this kind of serves the best of the both worlds. So on one hand, we have heterogeneities across countries. And on the other hand, because we combine information from the cross-section to estimate this distribution. So it serves as a channel that helps us to learn from the countries that starts early to sharpen the inference for countries that starts late. So within this general idea framework of panel forecasting here, we're considering a full Bayesian analysis with interval and density forecast. The reason is that because pandemic is a hugely uncertain event, so we want to use the full Bayesian analysis with interval and density forecast to capture all sources of uncertainties. So we'll be more specific about that. So here is the specific model that we're kind of idea of the model is a piecewise linear model, right? So this model is inspired by the famous SIR model. So basically, this SIR model is kind of commonly used in academic studies, and also recent economic research about the pandemic also use the SIR model. So I won't go through the details of SIR, but I just want to let you know that basically this SIR can be viewed as a set of difference equations or differential equations that's jointly modeling the dynamics of the three groups of the people: the susceptible, the infected, and the recovered. So here we are focusing on the infected group of people. So if we look at the panel on the left over here, so here we simulate the levels of this three group, and we focus on this orange curve over here. That's the population of infected. So basically, we see that this curve kind of have a bell shape, but the outbreak is much faster than the recovery. And if we look at the growth rate of this levels, infection levels, then this is the panel on the right, this is the dashed black line, that's the growth rate. And we see that basically this growth rate can be nicely approximated by a piecewise linear model. So based on this observation, we will model our infection growth rate at the downward sloping deterministic trend with the break at the peak of the infection. And then that's our deterministic part of the model. And then on top of this deterministic part, we also have a stochastic part. So basically that's autoregressive fluctuation around the deterministic trend. And basically, this stochastic part helps us to capture two things. One thing is that there could be time variation of the parameters beta and gamma. And second, it helps us to capture the deviation from this standard SIR model. So then let's translate our nice intuitions into equations. So basically here, we model the infection growth rate at deterministic part, that's the first two terms on the right-hand side, that's the piecewise linear model. And then the third term, the UIT, are the autoregressive shocks. Right? So first, the first two terms over here, xt, the regressors have the intercept, and the t is the trend. So then the coefficient gamma I are the heterogeneous coefficients, so they can differ across countries. Then the second term, basically this index function takes value 0 before the break and takes value 1 after the break. Then the coefficient delta are heterogeneous breaks that's different across countries as well. And if we look at the stochastic parts, the UIT, it follows the AR1 process, and the size of the shock to this AR1 have heterogeneity. So different countries could have different shock sizes. And in the end, we kind of have three sources of country-specific heterogeneities: the country-specific coefficients, gamma I, and the country-specific breaks, delta I, and the country-specific shock size, sigma I squared. So we can stack them together, and we get this vector of country-specific coefficients, lambda. And we can assume this lambda is drawn from an unknown underlying distribution F. So the key idea of this panel forecasting would be that, so we can think of it as a hypothetical two-step approach. So in the first step, basically we combine information from the cross-section to estimate this distribution F. So that's exactly the third term on the right-hand side over this equation. And then in the second step, once we estimate the distribution F, we can treat it as a prior and combine it with the country-specific time series data that gets the country-specific likelihood and gets the country-specific posterior of lambda I. Then this country-specific posterior of lambda I gives us better inference of the lambda I itself. And further, we have better estimate of lambda I, then it will provide us with better forecast of the future infection growth rate yi t plus h. Right? So basically here, that's as we highlight over here, we see that this F enters into both the first step and the second step. So it serves as a channel that combines the information from the whole cross-section to get better inference of country-specific parameters. And especially it can combine information from the country that starts early to get better inference of the parameters of country starts late. So just a note here is that although I described this procedure as the mentally two-step approach, but actually in terms of implementation, everything is done in one single step in this full Bayesian approach. Basically, if we put all the pieces together, we can provide the country-specific density forecast of infection growth rate. And it can capture all sources of uncertainties, such as the uncertainty due to the future shocks, uncertainty due to the heterogeneous coefficients, and uncertainty due to the parameter estimation of common parameter rho and the distribution. Okay. So once we get the density forecast, we can easily construct the point forecast and the interval forecast. And once we got the forecast of infection growth rate, we can translate it into the forecast of infection levels, basically using this exponential transformation over here. Okay. So now this is our model, and we can see how our model works with the real data. So the data we're using is the public available data from Johns Hopkins University, and follow the conventions in the academic study. Here we define the active infection as the confirmed cases minus the recovered cases minus the deaths. So in terms of the cross-section dimension, N is over 100 countries and regions. And in terms of the time dimension T, its daily data starts from the end of January until now. And we want to point out that the panel data we're using is actually an unbalanced panel because different countries start at different times. Okay? And before we dig into the exciting forecasting graphs, now let's first look at the estimates of the heterogeneous coefficients and estimates of the distribution of the heterogeneous coefficients. So here we focus on the parameter gamma 1, which is the coefficient of the trend before the break. Right? So the top left panel is the prior of the distribution of gamma 1 and the gamma 1I. And then the top right panel is the posterior of the distribution of gamma 1I. So notice here the prior and the posterior of both distributions or over distributions. So in that sense, that's why we use this hair plot to capture the uncertainty over the distribution over distributions. Okay? So basically from the prior to the posterior, it's kind of reflect our first mental step, right? So we combine information from the cross-section to estimate the underlying distribution of the heterogeneous parameters. So we see that basically the posterior is much more compact than the prior. So actually, there's indeed lots of information from the cross-section we can learn from. And the last panel, the bottom right panel, is the distribution of the point estimates of gamma 1I. So that's a gamma 1I estimates for each of the country. And from the second panel to the third panel, you can think it as our second mental step, that we treat the estimated distribution of underlying individual specific parameters like estimated, and then we treat it as a prior and combine it with the country-specific likelihood to get the country-specific estimates of gamma 1I. Right? So basically here we see that this histogram is again much more compact than the posterior distribution of F. So that's also expected because basically in the third panel, due to this second step, we have extra information. That's the time series of each of the countries. Okay? So now let's move on looking at the infection growth rate. So on our website, we have our weekly updates of over 100 countries and different forecasting price and different forecasting origin. But here, let's focus on the sample that ends at April 18th. So, and it's the forecasting horizon of this sample is also April 18th. And now let's focus on 3 countries, China, Korea, and Germany. So why we choose these 3 countries, reason A is that they start at different dates. So that's kind of a way to examine our intuition that we can learn from countries that starts early, like China, to get better inference for countries that start late, like Germany. And also reason B is that basically at the forecasting origin, these 3 countries are at different stage of the epidemic. So we can examine this kind of heterogeneity in terms of this unbalanced panels. Okay, so the top panels are plots the fitted regression lines. So basically, we see that this piecewise linear approximation kind of did a good job in approximating the deterministic part of the involvement of growth rates, infection growth rates. And the bottom 3 panels give us the interval forecast of the infection growth rates. So basically, here, the vertical line represents our forecasting origin, that's April the 18th. And for China, and actually for other countries before this forecasting origin, we have the actual data. And after the forecasting origin, the black line represents the point forecast based on the median of the posterior. And then the dark gray area are the 20 to 80% of the interval forecast, and the light gray area would be 10 to 90% of the interval forecast. So we see that basically this point forecast reflects the deterministic part of the involvement of the pandemic, and then the interval forecast help us to examine the uncertainties around this deterministic component, including both the parameter estimation uncertainty and the shock uncertainty. So basically, we see that China, the band is much narrower, and Germany, the band is much wider. So why Germany has wider bands? Two reasons. First, the estimates of sigma I, the shock size for Germany, is larger. So it has larger shock uncertainty. And at the same time, for Germany, it's just past the peak. So it doesn't have many observations to infer the second leg of the piecewise linear function. So in that sense, it also have a larger parameter estimation uncertainty. And now let's move on to the forecast of infection levels. So here again, we're looking at these three countries, China, Korea, and Germany. And the top panels, we only include parameter uncertainty, and then in the bottom panels, we consider both parameter and shock uncertainty. So the first thing we can see is that the recovery is actually slower than the outbreak. So that's the pattern in the data, and it can be captured by our piecewise linear model. And the second is that if we compare the top panels to the bottom panels, we can see sizable parameter estimation uncertainty and sizable shock uncertainty. Especially for Germany, from the top to bottom, we see that the width of the band actually increased by around 50%. Okay? And the third thing you may notice is that now the band is not symmetric. It's skewed and have large upside risk. So the reason is that because from the growth rate to levels, we need to do this exponential transformation, and that generates this large upside risk. And especially for Germany, in terms of growth rate, there's 20% of the chance that Germany will have positive growth rate. And if we translate that into levels, it means that there is the possibility there could be a second wave for Germany. So that's why we have this large uprise. So as time goes by, we can we can observe the actual data, and then we can overlay our actual data over our forecast. So here we're looking at the 1 week ahead actual realizations, and we see that the actual infections is actually close to our point estimates and point forecast, and also it's within our band of interval forecast. So then as time goes by, we can also expand our samples, means that we expand our forecast origins. So here we summarize all forecast origins for 1 week ahead forecast. So in the graph, the x-axis will be different forecast origins, and the y-axis would be the empirical coverage frequency. So here we have the 20 to 80 band, that's the blue curve over here, and the target coverage frequency would be 0.6. And we also have the 10 to 90 band, that's a red curve, and the target frequency would be 0.8. And we see that the empirical frequency across all horizons are kind of close to the nominal credible values. So that's kind of good news. Okay? So here is the takeaway of this presentation. So the goal of this paper is trying to provide interval and density forecasts of COVID-19 infections for a panel of countries and regions. And here we use the dynamic panel data models to account for heterogeneity across countries. And we combine information from the whole cross-section to estimate the unknown distribution of heterogeneous coefficients. So this helps us to automatically and efficiently learn from the countries that starts early to sharpen the forecast for countries that starts late. And in terms of modeling here, our model is a piecewise linear model motivated by the SIR model in the epidemic. And basically, we model the infection growth rate at the downward sloping deterministic trend with a break, and that's a deterministic part. And then on top of it, we also have a stochastic part that's the autoregressive fluctuations. And from our forecasting results, we see that there is large uncertainty, both due to parameter estimation and future shocks. So we want to stress that actually this large uncertainty is not specific to our model. It's kind of common feature in many epidemic forecasting models, because this kind of the nature of the academic is largely uncertain event. So in this sense, we would recommend interval and density forecast to evaluate this uncertainty. And from our 1 week ahead interval forecast, we see that our empirical coverage frequency is close to the nominal critical value. So here, as we said before, we have weekly updates of forecast on our website. And basically, you can find all kinds of information. Very interesting on the website is that forecast across countries, across different forecast regions, and across different forecast horizons. So yeah, so that's all for my presentation. And thank you very much.
So many thanks, Laura, for this wonderful presentation. Your paper illustrates very well the need to have access to international data and how to use this kind of data efficiently. And I encourage all of you to check the website that Laura was mentioning at the end, and that's very impressive. So you can get a lot of forecasts for all the countries in the world, basically. So that's super interesting. So we have time to take some questions from the floor.
Can I ask a question here?
Sure.
Please, Simon, go ahead.
Yeah, Laura. There's some key parameters in the SIR model, like the infection rate and death rate. So this rate are different for different countries and also might change dramatically over time. How do you guys tune these parameters in estimation?
So yeah, so that's a great question. So basically, again, that's so here is one of the graphs that shows the 3 countries. It's basically this is infection rate. So we see that actually it's indeed changing over time. And here that's we kind of follow the motivated by the SIR model. We model it by the piecewise linear. Instead, basically for the piecewise linear model, that's we see that although we only have 3 countries in this graph, but we can see that different countries could have different slopes and different intercept. So that's kind of incorporates the heterogeneity. So in terms of levels, there's even a big difference across countries, but in terms of the infection rate, it's still kind of within a range, right? So it's not like 1 or 2, or I think I saw some countries have 1 or 2, but it's not like 10. That's too much. Right? So does that make sense?
Yeah.
Can I have a question, Laura? Sure. I have one question.
Sure.
As econometricians, of course, we wish you best, right? We wish you a successful model. But unless you compare your forecast with, let's say, University of Washington model,
yes,
you can't tell, right? So have you done that, or how do they compare?
So I think I'm not systematically like compare with their model, because I think their model is based on SIR and with lots of tuning from expertise. So we didn't like compare, okay, the forecast exactly our coverage frequency to their coverage frequency. But based on the examination of the band, it seems that both of our band is kind of sometimes can get larger because just the uncertainty nature of the pandemic. And also, instead of comparing directly with their model, we compared with the SIR model country by country. So basically, we can estimate this SIR model that's I briefly showed you before, country by country, and then we do the forecast, and actually our forecasted performance is better than the SIR country by country, baseline SIR country by country. So yeah.
Possibly they don't give you this sophisticated confidence band, right?
No,
so
yeah.
A huge contribution that you are making here, and the estimating the uncertainty, and that can be emphasized also.
Yes. Thank you
That's
so much. Yeah.
Huge contribution to the public health literature.
Yeah, and also we're public available data and public available code, so everyone can use that.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Well, there is a question from Ralph Sonnenschein. Do you include in your model government regulations for closing and opening businesses?
That's a very great question. So there are two parts of answer to that. Is that we could include other regressors into this regression, and we can even allow heterogeneous response to this regressors. So we could do that, and probably we'll try that as well. But a little bit of concern on the side is that if our target is trying to do auto-sample forecast, then sometimes the more complicated model, although like it gives us more economic intuitions, but on the other hand, from forecast, it might not do a very good job. So, but that's a very good, valid point. So, any other suggestions?
No, that's okay. I don't see any other questions on my side. So maybe we can stop here. And thank you. Thanks a lot, Laura, for this nice presentation.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so I think we are coming to an end. So let me say a few words, and then Simon will conclude and do some announcements. So first of all, I would like to thank all of you, all the speakers and the participants, for taking part of this workshop. Of course, I would like to warmly thank Simon and the American University colleagues for the organization. I would like to thank the International Institute of Forecasters for their financial support. So to summarize a bit, it's difficult to summarize everything, but we are currently experiencing an historical moment. So this shock is something that was not really possible to predict. I remember that end of 2019, we were thinking about possible various risks likely to have an impact on the global economic growth. So we were considering, for example, the slowdown in China, the over-evaluation of asset prices on financial markets, or trade tensions between US and China. But honestly, the scenario of having a global pandemic was clearly not in the scope of macroeconomic forecast, or at least in my scope. The prediction that we did, in fact, of recession in the US, if you remember that time, we are using the spread between the 10 years and 3 months interest rate, and using some of Logit or Probit forecast, we were expecting a 50% probability of recession in the US in 2020, but in fact we were right, but not for good reasons, unfortunately. And
I had it on my website for a while, and I removed it now just to be sure that no one is asking.
There might have been a recession this year, even if. No?
Yeah, that was quite funny, and in fact the response was huge from policymakers, and this generate a complex sequence of big supply, demand shock, and on top of that, uncertainty shock, because what this is the first time in history that we are facing such a pandemic. So we are facing really a deep uncertainty at a night. So we are facing various type of shock, and that's quite difficult for us to see what's going on. So, but I think that reaction from economists and from the community was quite good, quite rapid. I saw a lot of good papers, good seminars, a lot of good data, and honestly, if we are not able to anticipate correctly, I think the reaction was quite good, and I'm quite proud. I'm quite proud of this at a global level, let's say. And one point that is really interesting to follow, it's about data. That is now getting good data. It's quite difficult, and I think two aspects are very much important in this respect. First of all, having access to international data, and the paper that was presented by Laura is very much important in this respect. That was also the point in the paper of Danilo, that is to be able to account for various leads and lags among countries. That is to take into account the experience of other countries is very much important. This is why I think that's very much important to have access to large international base of data. And the second point is about alternative data. So now, given that we are facing a big shift in GDP, we need to use alternative data. So alternative data, I mean everything that is not official. I mean Google data, traffic data, electricity data, why not satellite data, etc. For the anecdote, I was discussing a seminar 5 years ago by the French National Statistical Institute, and basically in the papers they destroy completely the use of Google data. They say Google data are not useful for consumption, you should use surveys, etc. And now, in fact, INSEE is publishing statistics based on Google data. So there has been a big shift in this respect. So the good thing for us is that we can deal with massive data, we can deal with high frequency data, we can do this kind of stuff. So this is why I'm pretty happy to have seen these very good papers in the workshop. So we can do a lot of stuff. So that's very good. And I think that unfortunately we will have to monitor the data for a while, because the crisis is not behind us. The economic crisis is really in front of us. I think that the forecasts done by Talibor are unfortunately they make sense, let's say. So there are some challenges, because dealing with this kind of data is not that useful. I don't know if you have already used daily data or weekly data, but there are a lot of noise around the data. The data have a lot of seasonalities, sometimes complex cyclical behavior that's not that easy to take into account. But I think that that's very promising for us. And with the tools that we have, we are ready to answer all the tricky questions that we can get from policymakers, from the public too, because that's going to be especially important to show to the public, to a large audience, that we are able to do to provide some good answer based on our models, based on our data. And I'm gonna stop here, and I would like to warmly thank all of you, and I give the floor to Simon to do some announcements.
Okay, thanks, Laurent. Again, same here. Following this workshop, I think Laurent and I, we're gonna organize a special issue for International Journal Forecasting. If you are interested, please let us know. At this moment, I'd like to invite all of you, if possible, turn on your video and audio. I want to give a special thanks to Chelsea Anderson for her tremendous help. I think she deserves a round of applause. Okay, okay, Chelsea, you want to say a few words?
Yes, thank you, Simon. That was so kind. So on behalf of American University, we are so incredibly grateful to Simon and Laurent for bringing this conference to us and asking to co-host and be a part of it. We are so incredibly grateful. Another big shout out and thank you to our Dean, Max Friedman, for being such a huge supporter of this event. This is such an important conversation and so timely and definitely needed. I'd also like to make sure that the CAS marketing team, Helen Dodson, Thomas Mail, Dylan Singleton, and Haley Jardas of the Dean's Office, they all were instrumental in creating the website for this event, getting our registration up and running, and helping to strategize how to create a virtual conference, because this is something that we are all still learning as we go. And so thank you to all the panelists, and thank you Simon and Laurent again for being such wonderful colleagues in this new journey, in this new adventure.
Okay, so that makes the end of the workshop on economic forecasting during COVID-19. We wish everyone well and healthy during these crazy times. Bye.
Thank you. Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you. We should
Bye.
thank you, Simon and Lohan. It's been great.
Thanks a lot.
Without you guys.
Next time, I hope to see you in person and share a beer.
Oh, yes, yes. Yes, yes.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.
Bye, bye.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.